How do we communicate this? The way we do it is by asking a few questions whenever we write these documents, whenever we're in meetings, whenever we're communicating something via email. We need to ask a few questions in order to give a proper perspective on this whole thing. We need to know who, what, when, where, and why all the time for mission, business needs, requirements, and for security. We need to know why we're doing this. Why is it important? We need to know how many details are needed for this documentation. We need to know who are we writing this to? Who's going to read this document? What is the format that we need? All of these things that we need to know before we even start. What is the format? Are we doing all of this in PowerPoint? Are we doing all of this in on a database? Or is it going to be on EMAS? Is it going to be on, which system is it going to be on? Or is it all just documents on spreadsheets? Is it on SharePoint? What kind of documents do we actually need to do, and for what? What documents are we? What are we documenting? And who of course, who reads it? Who's going to do the work? And what is needed in this documentation process? So those are all the things that we need to know as we go forward, as we prepare to create the security documentation. A lot of times what will happen is they'll just give you something and say, okay, I want you to document this, and they'll be very technical, like I want you to put these IPs here, and I want you to annotate what IPs have what vulnerabilities, and then I want you to give me go and contact this other department to see what we can do about fixing this and how long it's going to take, things like that. But sometimes what I've noticed is what they miss is how much detail do we need to put in this or that document, because that is super important. How much detail, and then who is my audience? Another huge one. So what I write for an executive is not necessarily what I'm going to write for a technical person who's in the weeds. They're two different audiences, and I really need to know who I'm talking to so I can use the proper language. So those are things that you need to know before you even get into this. That helps you to have a scope and have a context to bring all this information together before you even start. Now let's talk about what types of documents we actually have to do. For cybersecurity compliance, we are going to be doing a lot of authorization packages. An authorization package consists of system security plan, plan of action and milestone, and other documents. Another thing that we might end up doing is security policies, also known as directives, instructions, standards, something that's kind of overarching for the whole organization, for a whole department. We also may be doing documentation for privacy and security assessments. We also may be just collecting evidence. Sometimes it's not even writing things. It's just collecting evidence that already exists and putting them together. Now let's talk a little bit about the authorization package. We're going to go in greater detail. In fact, we're going to write some of these things from scratch. But I just want to give you an overview of what it is these things are before we start on those things. System security plan. It sums up the security posture of a system. It's for one system, and it tells you what are the boundaries of this system, what are the characteristics of this system, what are the security controls that are on the system, and how are they implemented. Then you've got a plan of action and milestone. This is for documenting system security controls that can't necessarily be implemented right now, but we have a plan with milestones in place to get this done. Then you've got a security assessment plan. So security assessment plan, something we'll talk a little bit more about later, but that's a plan to actually conduct the assessment. Who's going to do the assessment, what's involved, what's the scope, who's involved, and then how are we going to do it and where. And then of course the results of that go into what's called a security assessment report, and that just breaks down all the stuff that we found during our assessment. And then privacy assessments is another thing that we do, and artifacts. Another thing we do is security policies, directives, and standards. This is how the organization deals with the security controls. Who is responsible for the security controls? When will they be implemented? How will they be monitored, and when? It really establishes the context and the direction of the organization as a whole and how we address these different security controls. Privacy and security assessments. This talks about the confidentiality of certain information, the integrity of certain information, the availability of certain information, and the exposure of all the information. What we're talking about with exposure is how can somebody access this information? Is it on the DMZ? Is it on the internet? Is it on a web server that's available to everyone? Or is it on a protected server that's inside of your network? That's what we mean by exposure. How open is it to the public? How open is it to employees? And as we're doing assessments, we want to see this stuff from a malicious perspective. If I was a hacker, if I had malicious intent, how would I go about exploiting this? And we're going to write to C-level people and technical experts. Another thing that we have to cover as compliance experts in doing risk management framework documentation is artifacts. These are the actual evidence that's in place